I feel like we had this kind of cultural moment where it was like, and I remember this only coming, this is so dark, but our interests intersected. This was pre Elon taking over Twitter. So Patrick's interest being Twitter and mine involving, things like meditation and body work and yoga and whatever. And so I remember showing you that like really dark tweet that was like, nice body you got there. It would be a shame if it kept the score.
Like, I see that too.
Wait, whose was that tweet?
I don't know.
I'll find it.
Somewhere.
I'll find it.
Yeah.
Wait, I need to write that down.
I'll find it. I'll cite it. I'll put it in I will cite this tweet in the show notes.
I love it. I love it. I mean, that's classic. I mean, we can just use that as the little lightning rod comment that like governs this entire conversation.
Right. Right. But it was at that moment where it was like the body keeps the score, like zoom to the top of the charts. And I think it's still there pretty much. And I mean, I don't know what precipitated that, because that's obviously, it's a huge book. It's very it's still controversial.
Yeah. And that was 2014. I mean, that was like, and then it's like airport bestseller. It's like,
right.
It's like,
and it's long.
And it's pre-pandemic that it was such a big deal. I mean, like I think probably I'm curious to see how sales have like, accelerated even after the pandemic, but like, wow. Yeah. Like that's something.
Yeah, but it's remarkable. I mean, it feels like it marked such a distinctive cultural moment.
Yeah.
And I mean, for me, I've always been like, for like the 10 people who actually like it when I talk about philosophy is like, Descartes was wrong. Like that's the other, and like, we know that, but like, there's an interesting kind of shift of like a collective knowing of that.
Yeah.
Like, and this idea of, trauma living in the body, and also this moment of trauma becoming a word that everybody talks about. And then almost immediately, like the backlash that's like, don't say trauma.
Yeah. It is a real moment where there are those two poles, right? Like, it's like, either there is a kind of what is it? The trauma plot. People were talking about that in literary circles. And then like, it seems like trauma has become such like this catchphrase, like everyone's triggered, everyone's from, there was that. And then there was the sort of, yes, like the backlash against it, which is, that's just not something that, there's a biggest critique, against that as well. And the devil's somewhere in the details between that. I mean, this is where it's like, this is a contradictory thing. I mean, like how trauma actually does inform our relationships, our culture, society, ourselves, our bodies. And then at the same time that it's kind of become this overdetermined way in which we refer to ourselves and our relationships and even our life stories and all of that is, that tussle is like, it's not over yet. Like, especially I think the way in which the self-help culture and everything else also ties into it. It's like, and the sort of narrative of the self in this society, the individualism that like kind of undergirds so much of how we engage in culture, like all of that is, I think, is gonna it isn't over yet. It's back and forth.
No, in a similar key, I'm thinking about how, and I think this was roughly simultaneous to that, maybe a little bit later. It definitely kicked off. It was definitely fully in swing by 2020, but there was this kind of backlash, or almost like preemptive backlash, against sort of online leftist discourse of like bodies and spaces, and people were making so much fun of this phrase, like, and bodies and spaces this, bodies and spaces that. And I can understand on some level that type of, just as a tag, that could be strange to people, and like, of course, people will be like, well, people who'll talk like this will diminish the question of individual agency, etc., and that's fine. And perhaps you have a bad experience with like a Deleuze person on a panel, or like some kind of splinter Maoist at a meeting, and you're like, okay, I'm done with Kant and jargon, and these people are ipso facto bad. But on another level, I remember just thinking, like, what else do we have? Do you know what I mean? Like, besides bodies and spaces, like, I don't know, like time and mind, maybe, or like space and noumena. I don't really know. Like, there's no. And then by 2019, 2020, when the police were like using chemical weapons on crowds of people. And then you'd see these literal protester formations come apart because people literally couldn't breathe while they were chanting that they couldn't breathe. And then the police were kettling them and throwing them into vans. And then they were all getting COVID anyways, or like they were getting COVID because they were being confined in like Rikers. And meanwhile, people online were being like, well, actually no one should be protesting if they really cared about anything, COVID or the murder of civilians, because, then they're, and I was like, well, this is Bodies and Spaces. Like power is working through corralling people and forcing them to encounter their body one way or another, or at least by dropping bodies. And it just felt, I don't know, I feel like there is a there, even if the phrase can be annoying sometimes.
Yeah, there is a there. And, it's interesting because, I think that it obviously in certain, it makes me think of, when does it sort of catch fire in a cultural moment? When does it become a popular discourse, right? Like when did Bodies and Spaces then become like part of the cultural zeitgeist, as opposed to, we know that there's this trajectory and this like of, whatever, when Abby was saying Descartes was right. I mean, that there is this binary of like sort of, mind, rationality, the masculine, the Eurocentric, and then there's the sort of body, savage, woman. I mean, there is this sort of implicit binary in so much of cultural discourse. And then I think that those waters have been muddied for a long time. And I think it just depends on this, there's different spaces where that has already been happening. But this broader moment of suddenly everyone being like, oh, right, bodies that can't breathe, power, the impact of power on bodies and what that produces, in terms of, violence, but also violence, whether it's like it's physical, like asphyxiation and, the crushing, the ending of breath, and life. And also just the sort of the way in which our attention is completely like captured, grabbed, and organized for us, and has become a unit of production in the society pretty much, or with the way in which that anxiety gets produced simply by being a kind of, having a kind of survivor's guilt even.
Yeah.
As well as like actually the anxiety and re-traumatization of everyday life, depending on one's class position or how one's racialized or gender. There's just so many ways in which we're constantly encountering one another's and our own bodies, encountering our bodies, reflected back to us. And then there's the experience of being in a body and that's a constant dialogue. It's like what is happening in society and then how we feel it, and how we feel it on a sensory level and a physiological level, and then translate that into like an emotional and theoretical level as well. I mean, those things are happening very fast for us all. All those boundaries seem to be blurring, at least, and people are kind of trying to track that in different ways. So Bodies and Spaces, it seems to be that conversation has just, I think, had more and more traction, over time.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so excited to welcome Sumitra Rajkumar. Sumitra cut her movement-building teeth in the racial justice uprisings of mid-90s New York. The fierce collective dignity of those times instilled a lifelong commitment to justice. Over the course of multiple decades, she's produced documentary work with youth, run intergenerational popular and political education workshops, provided organizational support to a range of groups, and has been trained in and continues to innovate a practice in politicized forms of somatics, a method that connects personally embodied values to social transformation. Sumitra has applied this 15-year practice to leadership development and therapeutic support for organizers, cultural workers, and social justice organizations. She now works at the Action Lab at the intersection of educational and cultural strategy through training methodology for social movements. Her labor of love is a fellowship called The Art of Purpose, weaving together the political, the emotive, and the creative as an organizing force towards a better world. Sumitra, welcome. We're so excited to have you on the show.
So excited and honored to be here.
Well, let's get into it. I'm so excited to talk about somatics, which is this word I think that people throw around but don't necessarily know what it means, other than it has something to do with the body and bodies. But first, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background, how you came to practice somatics, and also about your work at the Action Lab?
Great. Well, I'll start way at the beginning, maybe. I was born in South India. My first language was Tamil.
Mm-hmm.
And I was brought up in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. This is in the 80s. I went to Catholic school with Hindu parents and in a pretty hyper-capitalist, liberal, theocratic Muslim state. And went to school in Texas then for 4 years, and then have lived in Brooklyn in the same neighborhood since 95. And then I guess it was in New York where my main political formation happened during the uprisings against police brutality. And then September 11th happened. And then in Texas, also the fight against apartheid in South Africa, the Gulf War, and Rodney King were big shaping forces for me, very politically formative. So in New York, I worked with young people, with teenagers, co-producing documentaries for a while, doing popular education work for about a decade. Tried to make a documentary myself about the building of the tallest building in the world by migrant workers in Dubai. But because I had family living there who would just face the backlash of a very repressive authoritarian state, I didn't do that. Instead, I joined an organizer training institute called Social Justice Leadership in East Harlem. That was back in 2010. And they were doing this thing where they were connecting personal transformation to social transformation. They were doing it through connecting hard, organizing skills to political and strategic education, to organization building skills, and then to this thing called somatics. And so I was pretty suspicious of it at first. I grew up meditating with my grandmother, but I had this suspicion of New Age American, why were these people meditating before a meeting? I had my own biases, but then I just got hooked because of the potential it had, and got just super curious about it, because community organizers in their organizations were kind of falling apart.
Yeah.
Because of all kinds of relationship drama and unaddressed trauma responses and all kinds of transferences. And this was kind of before. This was way before Body Keeps the Score.
Right.
Came out in 2014 and became that airport bestseller we all know. So the social justice leadership, I would say that was in partnership with an organization in the Bay Area called Generative Somatics. And I would admit, politically, there was this kind of syncretism going on, because in social justice leadership, people were seasoned community organizers coming out of LA, coming out of New York, coming out of Florida, but they were also kind of had this sort of third world Marxist, political shaping and steeping. And then in the Bay Area, Generative Somatics was, these are my assessments. This is my way of seeing it, but they were coming out of sort of, maybe I would say, a sort of anarcho-liberal feminist kind of perspective and shaping, but this was this attempt to kind of take somatics that as the sort of leaders of the organizations had been schooled in it and trained in it, and then apply it to movement building back then. And then as social justice leadership just crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. I went deeper into studying how to practice. I just trained myself more deeply in somatics as a practitioner and a teacher with generative somatics. And, I kind of went into I trained with them for a bit, but then I went into a sort of movement heartbreak mode where, I became the witch at the end of the street, and people came to see me more through word of mouth, and they were mainly organizers and cultural workers, and so that happened like for a really long time until I joined the Action Lab. And I feel like I had my ear to the ground of community organizing and social movement building in a very particular way behind the scenes. So, and then at Action Lab, we're experimenting with this fellowship, but also with this broader methodology that's really reflecting on all the sort of contradictions of the work thus far, because I think somatics itself is a very nascent and contradictory field. And so to reconnect some of those dots now with political education and training for organizers connected to then this particular methodology.
So maybe we can talk, we like to do a lot of like ground clearing and definitions on this podcast.
Yeah.
We never met a definition that we didn't like. Well, at least like to like, ask about, spin out. But I'm hoping you can come at this in whatever way you want, but really about the question of like, well, what is somatics? When you say generative somatics, what does that mean? What are the origins of this field? And I'm going to throw out a couple of questions and, take this in whatever direction you want, of course. But, how does somatics or a somatics perspective approach ideas like the self, like trauma, like embodiment, like when you say bodywork? What are some of, let's say, the underlying presuppositions that might make somatics as a field or a practice or a methodology different from something like talk therapy or psychoanalysis?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, generative somatics, it's the name more of an organization. It's the organization in the Bay Area.
No, that's helpful.
The somatics that I learned, and, at this point, there are so many different kinds of somatics, practitioners, trainers, institutes, all of that. But the somatics that I came out of, and at this point, how I like to encapsulate just what it is the body is part of the self. It's regarded as part of the self. But that self is a relational self. So even when we're alone, we're populated.
Yeah.
And there's a neurobiologist, Lisa Feldman Barrett, who talks about, the best thing for a human nervous system is another human, and the worst thing for a human nervous system is another human. And every time I bring that up with organizers, they just they repeat it. I mean, repeat it back to me. That resonates so strongly.
Yeah.
So the body is the self is relational. We are shaped and we shape back. So those are the four, I would say, fundamental tenets of somatics, and probably a more politicized somatics. So at this point, so if we're talking about somatics writ large, it's a form of embodied practice where the body is regarded as part of the self, and you actually do practices, whether they involve breath, noticing what's happening below your own neck, like really dropping your weight, unclenching and clenching to sort of notice where you sort of are habitually contracting, as all part of a inquiry into just what's happening for you habitually, but also maybe like what sort of past historical events might have shaped into you. So that is sort of somatics writ large. But I think the somatics that I practice, it's the body is the self is relational. We are shaped. And when we say we are shaped, we're shaped by intimate networks, family, whatever sort of origin, guardianship, the community or neighborhood that you're a part of, the sort of intimate cultural field or space, institutions, whether they're educational, religious, prisons, right? There's a whole institutional sphere of shaping. Social norms and forces, whether it's capitalism and sort of regional kind of politics or the political economy, so real material shaping, as well as like racial, gender. I mean, all of the sort of social norms that we find ourselves in, And then also landscape and environment that you grew up in, as well as like a kind of any kind of broader meaning making or spiritual tradition that you might come from. All these things are shaping, but we shape back. So they're interrelated, and they shape each other and shape us. And then we shape them, all those spheres back. So we have a kind of diagram where we show these concentric circles of shaping, and that like we are shaped by all of those spheres, and then we have the potential to shape those back, because agency is very key in this, individually and collectively, in the kind of contradictory ways in which we will. So that piece is also really important in the somatics that we're trying to keep exploring and innovating on, is that change is constant, but intentional change happens by facing contradictions. And those contradictions can be really internal and can be relational and can be like external and societal. And all those things are happening all the time. And so I am very interested in a non-essentialist and a non-deterministic but high agency orientation of just really trying to recognize our potential in the way that, like, potential as in also power, right? Like the potential for a kind of collective power that we need to actually reorganize the material conditions that cause so much trauma in the first place. So that is also another push and pull, is where do we place our attention? What do we prioritize day to day? And then, like, as we organize, like, how do we actually prioritize our attention, both in order to recognize that we're changing already and constantly, and how do we get intentional about it? And then how do we also do this collectively? How do we like come together to really like maximize our potential for change, for intentional change?
I was trying to think about what you were saying, and also some of the materials you sent us and that I reviewed before we spoke. And I'm very much not in my comfort zone in multiple senses here in thinking about much of this, but I was listening to you talk and trying to find points of contact with some of sort of the, broadly speaking, ecumenical psychoanalytic psychodynamic theory that is closer to my bailiwick, and I think may overlap, at least with some of the things we've talked about on the podcast in the past. And what I wanted to sort of run by you in terms of themes or things that I'm hearing through what you're saying, but that, just tell me if I'm picking this up in terms of what you're laying down. I was first thinking about how, for a person with psychoanalytic or psychodynamic commitments, or even vaguely, the question of like what the body is not as I don't think should be a very clear, concrete thing, right? On some level, it's very real. It's a place where a lot of things happen, but also it's not the same thing as like the anatomical body or the mortician's body of like a person on a slab or something, or let alone like, I don't know, like the Vitruvian Man. Instead, it's sort of it's a term that has heuristic value and seems to do work both theoretically but also practically when thinking about development and our experiences and relationships between people. And so in that sense too, I was thinking about the way in which a thing like the psyche, whatever the hell that is, can be described. And I think one of the formulations that I like the most is sort of like it's like an organ, but for experience, or for like metabolizing events into experience. But in any event, it has a thing that a lot of thinkers want to emphasize in this tradition, is that whatever this thing is, it's called the psyche. It has some sort of material overlap with the body. And so that seems like one point of contact. And thus, the question of like what a body is or what a body can do is not given. And thus, people talk about bodies in different ways. One can't necessarily immediately be like, oh, well, this is not the anatomical body, because that's not what psychoanalysis is. And God even knows what like the anatomical body is as like an abstraction versus as its particulars. The second point of contact that I was thinking about was this theme of like the dynamic, or this idea that processes are kind of ongoing involving this body, but also that whatever those processes are or events are, whatever like the terms of this orientation might be, you can have things that kind of traverse or cross individual bodies, but that also kind of ramify and operate on different levels of complexity of organization. And this again pushes on the broader sense of what a body can be. A body is both an individual body, but also it's, the body of the family or the body of the nation or what, but the term body can
collective body.
That's I think that's precisely what I wanted to sort of push at, namely that the question of like singularity or individuality versus like otherness or shared traits or features is also mutable and ongoing and involves temporalities and efficacies in a way that is plastic and that can be reworked and, as I take it, shaped in some way or might be like reshaped. And then I guess sort of the third thing I was thinking about in this sense, and I think this is something I find very attractive in what you're saying too, is if we have these kind of working broader sort of remits for what the body is and for how bodies relate and how processes of causality or influence or change can happen both in bodies but between bodies, etc., we can both be attuned to how they kind of operate or don't operate or get stuck or freeze in different points of time, but also how they can be unstuck or reconnected or reconfigured, not just with an eye towards like a temporality that's different in the way, like the temporality of the past of trauma is present, in the present, as it were, but also with an eye towards a future that specifically instates or emphasizes a type of agency or like an intentionality, right? So it's not just like a random deterministic, but all of these reductive biophysics of like bodies of people hitting one another and God knows what comes out of it, but that rather there can be some type of conscious intervention on the part of individuals, but also mediated through others or through others in a collectivity or whatever, to shape what bodies go off to do or to rework what has happened to them in the past with an eye towards a future that could be different. Does that scan?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
That's fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. No, it really does. I mean, I also love what you're saying about just that this is not fixed, and the body is like this heuristic, and we know that it's more like there's a confluence of stuff, really, that like, and then with a kind of, they're loose sets of, I guess, for lack of a better word, and really the words are, the words are almost limited, right, to describe what we're talking about. But that the body, whether individual to collective to sort of like outward from that, like just all the various kinds of collective bodies and structures then that start to work their way out. And we still use the term body to describe them because there's some sort of coherence to that particular identity, whether it's individual or collective. But that sense of confluence and flow and flux is, yes, absolutely like how we want to regard our bodies. And yet then there is that intervention, as you put it, or that intention, right, to sort of organize ourselves under pressure. And that is because we have this orientation to wanting to intentionally change the world. And in my language too, and I struggle with the jargon and also this need to sort of there's a popularizing, clarifying aspect to it. There's real like kind of, I think, layers and complex weeds to it. I think, but the point is that like, because we're working with the main humans that I work with are organizers, people who are trying to organize, right? And because I work with organizers, I think that propensity towards like, yes, building power, developing agency, so that intervention and that sense of, trying to come up with a praxis of reflection and practice, and this is a very practice oriented methodology for that reason, without being reductive, is incredibly challenging. I mean, it's incredibly challenging, because you kind of you want to have a kind of shared language and practice and sort of organize people into it, and then immediately you want to not be rote, and fixed. So it's constantly under that kind of, I feel like the methodology itself is constantly under that kind of pressure. And yet to commit to, a process of change, to put it really simply. this is where like the somatics that I've come out of, the lineages that I come out of, like interweave everything from like Aikido, and acupressure and meditation and yogic asanas with like Gestalt psychology and like and psychoanalysis, and so there is this sense of what is repressed, and that there is our sort of what lies under the surface does have to, that we kind of have to open that up to ourselves in order to just to deepen the conversation with ourselves and others in a way that allows for the most open, connected, and rigorous change-making processes that can be both that are weirdly individual and collective across a range of bodies. What comes to mind also is like, this sociogenic principle of Fanon, or like the bios mythos of Sylvia Wynter, of just this kind of, also there's this sort of biologically inflected practice that is in itself very conjunctural, right? It shifts over time, like who we are culturally, who we are in our quote unquote bodies also shifts. It's not so fixed or determined. And then there are stories we tell ourselves about it too, and that's constantly an interplay. So just because somatics, and this again, I keep saying this kind of somatics that we're trying to work through, because I think there are somatics that's like move from your thinking self to feeling self, and we can go into that. There's like a whole kind of culture, I think, that's like about let's not think, and instead this is, I think, this is about the relationship between those different things that make up who we are and how we need to keep pushing the envelope. There is a kind of linearity that we're seeking at the same time that we're constantly revisiting and revisiting and revisiting. So even that is itself happening at the same time.
That's really clarifying, and I appreciate the appeal to, or the invocation of Fanon. I think is so clear, and also, though, I think very profound about like how, at least in a certain Western nation state organizing logic, the state is metaphorically but also organically related to the production of certain types of families and to a certain family model, and that is not given so much as continually performed and enforced through operations of power, and also sort of, the media and psychic interventions and like literal counterinsurgency repression on other types of families and bodies. And so I think that's really clarifying. And I think, with an eye towards what I know Abby wants to ask you next about practice and about some of the methodological questions, I think I was, again, coming back to something else, another example of some psychoanalytic thinking that I think is both one of those things that is both very simple but also profound, and yet also I think maybe cries out in light of what you're saying for more reflection on my part, perhaps, which is a moment actually in Jonathan Lear's very good book about Freud, right? Where he's doing a very, like, I want to recommend that to everyone. That's his little introduction to Freud in the Rutledge series, where he's trying to talk from almost a perspective of like an analytic philosopher, like as opposed to continental, just like, so he's very interested in language and in this idea of a certain notion of consciousness, even as he wants to disrupt it, where he's like in the dynamics of this thing called transference, which I think a lot of what you're saying really seems to ramify to me in the transferential space.
Yeah.
A person reading Freud for the first time or thinking about these things for the first time might be like, how is it possible that we could have an unconscious belief? How can we have a belief that is not present to our awareness? And the example that Lear gives, which is, on the one hand, I think very clear, but also now I want to probe with you, is the idea of how in a therapeutic encounter where we have a certain asymmetry of knowledge and the transference is kind of like, i.e. the clinician hasn't disclosed as much and the patient is disclosing all these things. And then there's this sort of pressurization of the stakes and all these projections are flying from one to the other. And then the analyst shifts in his, and I think his probably works best for this analogy, chair, and the patient moves as though they're about to be struck, right? And Lear then using this, I think, to explain the concept of transference is like, well, something is happening out, some script, some set of projections, something is being activated here where the patient seems to have we could say has an unconscious belief that they are about to be hit by the transference, or rather hit by the transference they are. They might be hit by the clinician because of something, they've been hit by a parent or they've been a father, or there's just some sort of, there's an embodied enactment there. And I both like that as an account of the transference, but also in light of what you're saying and in light of what I think what might clinically be possible in a somatics-based encounter, what the clinician then does is put that belief into language, tease it out, narrativize it, but they don't touch the patient, right? There's some certain things are not permissible there, or at least they're not included in that. And the logic of like shaping
that's a
or
pretty
healing,
basic rule.
Is instead being like, why did you just do that? I mean, did you notice you just did that? Did you think I was going to hit you? Why might I think I was going to hit you? Why would it make you feel? And not that that's not necessarily bad, but it does seem to foreclose certain other directionalities or possibilities for intervention. And I just,
that's a great example in this context.
It's a great example. And like, I'm laughing because I'm like, oh, we touch the patient. Yes, we do. I mean, that's the thing and this is so different, consensually. But, what was striking me first is that the conversation about power dynamics is very live. And, when you were talking about the sort of transferential, like, like on the left and in the spaces in which we operate, like with organizers, like the transference is rife and like, wow, you're just describing the left. I mean, we can be a shit show. We can be all love because I will never leave, I'm here. But I mean, we can just really do a number on each other. And so that's already live in the room, always in some form or the other. And so naming power dynamics feels like, that's something that is part of the sort of culture that we want to foster. That's the set of practices too. That's part of the set of practices. Yes. So then, people are introduced to this as it's not always contact, right? Sometimes it's sort of breath, gravity, connecting the dots between the sensations you're feeling and like the mood that you're experiencing and the thoughts that you're having. But then there's also, there is contact. Again, it's consensual and it's like, you say, is this okay? When people partner up and do different practices. And I realize that must all sound very opaque. Like even just me saying when people partner up and do all kinds of practices.
Well, we'll get into it. And
we'll get into it.
Yeah.
There is a format, that we kind of go into that, like, or there's a structure that we go into that does hold some of that. So that kind of open processing of when we're doing this in groups. And then like when I'm having a session one-on-one, this is also something that we name as part of, this is what you're sort of walking into the room for in some ways, right? And then that becomes like a conversation. And it depends. Again, this varies from person to person about what they are actually ready and open to doing. And so that's where we proceed with caution and a lot of care. And so it's sometimes people just dropping their attention below their own neck and like, either you find like, I don't feel anything and I don't know what you're talking about, or like, ow, this hurts, or I feel so much anxiety, this is too much. There's a kind of range of discomfort that can surge, or anxiety, or like lots of sensation can happen very much for some people, and others are completely numb. And all of that has to be navigated, with a lot of like clarifying in a field that's actually still very, very like tentative and young, and should be tentative and young, and is not always treated as such. It's like there's a lot of guru like posturing and a lot of like, sort of magical properties that end up like kind of governing and influencing like how this all happens. But I think there's something that it's a fascinating way of engaging with other human beings. It really, when you're starting to include what you're noticing in your own body, and a noticing of any patterns, a noticing of how longing manifests, or how, again, it's like, there's a practice we do when we're centering. And sometimes it's simply about, depending on where people are at, sometimes it's simply about like dropping your attention below the neck, noticing your breathing, dropping your weight, noticing where you're clenched. And then there can also be a slow sort of reorganization around like bring your attention to your center. From there, like can you drop your weight, but at the same time feel the space in your spine? And how does the word dignity connect to it? Like is that we're suggesting something there in like the embodiment of length? What is that actually? How does that resonate with you? How does it resonate to kind of notice if your peripheral vision is expanded or kind of closed off? How does it? I mean, without being, again, over deterministic or insensitive to the ways in which various cultural expressions might read differently and accounting for your own transference and all of that. How do you start to have a language that includes some of the sensory and what we're noticing about the sensory? How does that sort of deepen or like add dimension to all of these conversations that we're in around like transference, the body, power? What does noticing that and like you being kind of almost like your own, like rather than just sort of the body, okay, I'm going to exercise or I'm going to, I mean, this is the weirdness of this. And it's weird. It's weird for most people. It was weird for me when I encountered it. It's weird. Like, I mean, when you kind of feel your own senses from the inside out, what does it bring to the conversation that you're having with yourself and others?
We met at a party and you were telling me what you did. And I was like, that's amazing. Come and talk about it on the show. And then we had all of these emails and I was like, in my like little academic kind of way, can you send me a text? Right? Like is there a shared textual object? And you were like, well, I mean, maybe, but like, also like unask the question. Like you're asking Abby, like you're asking the wrong question because Somatics is not about us all it's not a fucking book club. It's not class. We're not all getting together around a shared textual object the way that, makes me comfortable. It's about practices. And I feel like a few minutes ago, you started to get granular. And I wonder if we can kind of almost like start from the beginning, because I think many of our listeners will have a sense of what happens when you go into some sort of psychodynamic therapy or even a group therapy situation. And I know you work both with individuals and also that you work with groups, particularly as you've said, you work with organizers. So I want to see if we can kind of like start from the beginning in terms of practices and be like, okay, well, what is like a day in your life in terms of like, what is it like to run a somatic session? What sort of practices are you asking individuals to do? What kind of practices are you asking them? Maybe if you said people get in a room and pair up, what are they doing together? Can you walk us through any of this? But I want to really see if we can get like super concrete and granular so that people who are tuning in and are like, again, I have some sense that this means more than talking, but I don't really know what it's like that they can walk away having a sense of this is sort of what you do.
There's a couple of sort of initial questions that I ask when a person, say, walks into the room. So this isn't a one-on-one setting. One is simply about longing. What do you long for? How do you long to be? Especially when the pressure turns up. And that conversation can go in a lot of different ways. Also, what do you want me to know about who you are and where you come from? So those are some initial kind of warm-up things. One of the early practices, or the first or most foundational practice actually, is a practice of centering. And the centering practice can look different ways. I'll describe it, but it's fundamentally, we actually say it's about being present, open, and connected, including under pressure. So it's about cultivating a practice to be present, open, and connected, including when the pressure turns up. We also say it's about cultivating a home base in your own body to come back to, and to deepen the conversation with yourself non-verbally. So it starts very simply by being aware of sort of light and sound and temperature, sort of arriving in your own senses, and then dropping your attention below the neck, noticing movement, noticing breath without correction or trying to change anything, but just getting super curious, scanning for clenching, scanning for like any kind of movement, any kind of pressure, any numbness, all of it being kind of gathering your own data. And then the process of centering. So if that's the body scan, then the process of centering is about organizing yourself somewhere around a kind of rough, like imagined center of gravity. And that comes from various different traditions that involve like this kind of like internal work with the body. And just sort of organizing yourself almost from that center so that you like, and this also comes from martial arts in some ways, like having that, when you're in an Aikido practice and someone's kind of coming at you, and if you're up in your head and like, it's a very different thing than when you're sort of lower to the ground, when your attention and the way you move is actually like lower to the ground, so that becomes like a place from which to kind of actually organize yourself in sort of length, width, and depth, like almost from the inside out in three different directions. And that it starts to give a grammar, a kind of grammar that then people can get that very sort of, they can make their own poetry out of it, but it gives a grammar and a kind of repetitive like format that people can sink into and use for their own practice exploration. Because fundamentally, this is a sort of practice-based methodology. This is almost like the muscle memory is a part of what it means to engage in sort of transformative processes. So that like there is something to having a practice that helps us organize under pressure. It's not a silver bullet. It's not the thing that's going to magically transform your entire, but it is because I think that it can become that for people, right? And it can lend itself very quickly to kind of culty behavior. So to retain all of the conversations around like transference and what's going on, that's beyond just that. But that this edition is very concrete in that way, in the body, like in sensory, in connecting the sensory field to your emotional life, to your inquiry, your longings, to your commitments, to a kind of like unfolding awareness of what the relationship might be in what you start to notice over time through doing that kind of practice, what the relationship might be between all of that, and then certain automatic reactions you might have under pressure. Automatic reactions that include like, whether it's like a sort of a fight, flight, freeze, fawn, you might, have heard that, or any kind of reactivity in that way, like a nervous system response. But also worldview, also like what is a pattern? To explore the pattern in your own shaping through all the various kind of spheres of shaping. This becomes a part of that conversation, right? So that we're exploring that. And as we unfold that awareness, we're also cultivating a practice of organizing under pressure. Organizing oneself under pressure, not in a sort of perfection or it's just optimally, so that you can start to when the pressure turns up and the noise turns up, can you soften that noise? Can you come back to a place that's quieter to be able to have that conversation with yourself with everything else going on? Like does having a conversation, that internal conversation with your own physiological response, right? It's a nonverbal conversation. Can that sort of muscle memory process of just observing, being super compassionate and curious about it, but then cultivating a practice in that, can that like be like a foundation for how you might practice it relationally in a range of different situations. And from that, we have then centered practices. So like you can imagine we have an off center, like which is how we are most of the time. I mean, like we're just, and then that journey back to like, oh, centering, what does that give me? So whether it's something as simple as making a request, for some people, that's an intolerable thing, right? Like it's so scary to ask for something or to say no or to, even enter into a relationship. I mean, there's just a range of things where we explore the sort of uncentered version. And this is just to be like, I'm just being kind of very sort of like very sort of like simplistic about it. There's more devils in the details, but the uncentered version and then the centered version to almost see the contrast, like what's possible, and then to practice that. To do it with curiosity is huge. To do it without a kind of like to recognize the inner critic or any kind of self-shaming or getting it right. This is rather just like, is through practice, is there a way to actually ease up, right? Ease up so that the conversation becomes more possible. All of the other conversations become more possible. All of the other actions become more possible so that your own emotional range feels like you can engage it. And that discomfort isn't necessarily danger.
Yeah. I've been a pretty serious yoga practitioner for years, and one of the reasons that I work with the teacher that I work with is that it's very much about like community, and it is I hear a lot of resonance with what you're saying. And one of the things that I often think when I compare like how I feel at the beginning, I practice at night, and so like 8 p.m. That's what I do yoga from 8 to 9. And like, I'm usually very, very jangly, and like the difference that I feel, an hour later is so remarkable. And part of, and this is what I'm trying to like, slowly articulate, is that at the beginning of it, the body feels very personal. And often if I've managed to like shake some things out, it's not that I'm like gone, right? It's not like ego death happens over, by the time you get to Shavasana. I mean, and thank goodness, actually.
Yeah.
But it's more like the impersonality of the body comes to the forefront, and the way in which, like, I might. Now, I know I'm thinking of an example that actually is from The Body Keeps the Score. The way that like some people might have real difficulties being in hip open or positions, especially people who are victims of sexual assault, right? It might be an enormous victory in someone's healing to be able to be in that very vulnerable hip opener kind of position. But that, sometimes there is this sort of sense of like, well, like it's you and you carry those worries or fears or tensions or patterns. But after having done some of that work of like a kind of like, diagnosis, self-diagnosis, and also self sort of treatment in a certain way, there is a letting go that happens. And you're like, well, this is this thing. It's me. It's also not me. It's both. That's fine. I can finally sleep. I do think there is something very powerful about being able to at once experience your body as this thing that is the repository of your history, right? And that moves with you through time and space, and that carries all of these residues of all of these patterns, but getting also kind of comfortable with it as just like this doing thing, this sensing thing, this feeling thing, right? Because then if you like, you're trying to balance and you fall down, who cares? You just like, you get back into it. As you were talking about some of the practices, I can actually feel some of those like nervous system relaxing kind of things just from your talking that are very familiar to me from other contexts. So,
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and, as you were talking, I was just thinking about how, we come by our, like the patterns, our tendencies under pressure, all of that really honestly.
yeah.
And we like to say that, is that come by these honestly. And that in some ways, it's funny how the kind of transformation we seek sometimes just comes from a kind of deep acceptance.
Yeah.
Kind of a radical kind of acceptance. And that can be kind of its own trope, but I think there is something about that letting go into kind of accepting kind of who you are in a way that allows you to also let go, not quite ego death, but let go a little bit of who you are and the grip of that negotiation all the time, that alert negotiation. But there's also something to just kind of mark that, like, we don't necessarily center or do the practices to relax or to be calm.
Mm-hmm.
It's rather to be able to have the conversation minus the noise, minus some of the noise. It's how we, at least that's how we sort of are exploring it, right?
Yeah.
Like that's how we're like, because for some people, it might be that they need they need more of an just an energetic experience of their anger, or and
that would be me.
I mean, and so if we are always saying, no, but this is about like cultivating a calmness, that's what we try to disengage that. I mean, it would be me too. I mean, like, or rather with me, it's like more like, oh no, I have this constant like rush of rage that like,
I would never get anything done without it.
That's the thing, is that it's like, if can we tolerate our range of emotions, and that they're kind of like the weather, like that, like actually how it feels, right? Like this, the rush or the coolness or the ickiness, just all of it. Can we actually tolerate greater and greater range, and what might that give us? If you long to explore your anger, right, and just really express it, what might that give you beyond catharsis, right? Like, right. I mean, we're not talking about catharsis here. We're talking about, can we ease suffering? Can we ease our suffering by tolerating more range, and knowing that we are bound to experience some painful circumstances in life, no matter what, in some ways, our material conditions are. And how do we allow for that? And what might it give us? And then when you add the process of change making to it, what might it give us? Like, to me, it's actually like, that's fucking crucial.
Yeah.
Whereas like a lot of our, let's say, change making processes or organizing processes, social movement processes are sort of almost dependent on suppressing the emotional life. I mean, a lot of organizers, that's the sort of, we actually like, we don't have time for that.
Right. Sumitra, one of the reasons that we have been so excited to talk with you is that your work has always had this distinctly leftist political dimension to it. And that's in such stark contrast to the way that, so many elements of other somatic practices, as many people have pointed out, have either remained resolutely apolitical, or I think more noticeably have like really taken a hard right turn. And I'm thinking here about certain dynamics in parts of the wellness industry, certainly including yoga, but other like embodied mindfulness practices. And so I want to ask, I know you said before that it's not, somatics isn't about turning inward. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but so much of what you're talking about is about becoming more attuned to the self and its embodied states and feelings. Is it fair to say that you're helping people to attune to themselves in this way in order to be able to turn outward, like to be with others, to help others? I mean, I guess another way of putting this is to ask you, what does a politicized somatics, which is a term that I've heard you use, what does a politicized somatics mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It is about tuning in. So it's not about tuning in. It's not about tuning in, but it is about tuning in order to also to relate, to turn outward,
Mm-hmm.
to engage, to build even with others. So that to me, the sort of politicized version of somatics is really that.
Mm-hmm.
It's the ability to turn in, tune in,
Mm-hmm.
while also not tuning out, but turning outward.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to kind of continue to stay in relationship in a collective way, and to actually tune into the relationships around us, right? And through constantly returning and recommitting and building one's capacity to recommit to building in that way towards reorganizing the conditions that have caused so much of the harm in the first place to our internal states, um, as well as our external states, right? And that's tough in and of itself, because this is finite stuff. We have finite lives and finite capacities and finite amounts of attention, and to be able to do that, to sort of turn inward. A very simple practice, for example, is while centering. You can center. Sometimes with meditation and centering, there are practices with that where you close your eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And with centering, in some ways, your eyes are open. That is, if you have, if sight is one of your available senses, your eyes are open, and you can be in motion, you can be talking, you can be actually engaging with people and also centering. And that's part of the practice. And it's not going away. It's like staying in relationship. But to your point, Abby, about so much of somatics. So that's a practice. I mean, that's like that's across the board in somatics. It's the relationship can still be a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just about turning inward, it's about your relationship, but they can stay at this interpersonal kind of like small level, for one, like just at your most immediate network. And there are a couple of different things that I think that we should be very like open at, that this is an open struggle,
Mm-hmm.
right? In that I do think even we're not immune on the left, or in activist circles and in organizer circles of becoming highly narcissistic,
Yeah.
highly inward, and completely disengaging, but still politically posturing. I mean, it's not like, I mean, we can do that. Like, even if we might care about the fate of the world in a different way, we can become quite insular. We can become quite shut down. We can become quite cut off. We can become quite critical and policing. We can become, we're not somehow like the fascism. The fascism resides within us too.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to wrangle with it, and so I think that there is definitely a proclivity in doing somatics practice to like let it be all about just turning inward, shutting down, and doing a kind of spiritual bypass. Sometimes we call it it's be the change, and that's all you need to do. And that can happen very much in our circles as well. It's like it's an active, I think, struggle. It's an active contradiction. How do we, I mean, Hannah Proctor says this, how do we fight and heal at the same time? We find the ways. We find the ways through practice. We find the ways through conversation. We find the ways about being honest about how we can be as humans, and not try to put it all in neat boxes, but rather stay in practice and reflection. Daniel Carr has the other way I think that like this can go right, it can, as opposed to left, is, I think talks about a kind of trauma literalism. And there is, so that the body becomes this sort of almost like both literal and metaphoric at the same time.
Yeah.
So, and that I think leads to a certain kind of essentialism, where a certain expression, a certain gesture, a certain move, a certain even sensory capacity becomes very quickly associated with different groups, or like there's like, I mean, we can get that can happen very quickly. Something that I think is really hard to kind of parse out in a politicized form of somatics, that doesn't overly fix who we are and how our bodies need to be, is, really kind of undoing any kind of roteness. We're guilty of jargon. We're guilty of a certain kind of roteness ourselves. So constantly, like, I think we have to constantly ruffle our own feathers in that sense. We have to constantly kind of break out of some of the sort of trauma literalism, but at the same time, and the metaphor that the body can take on, just kind of automatically, like this means this. Also, that like certain sort of expressions, certain ways of to really account for transference and not overdetermine what things mean, to account for cultural difference. There's so many things there that can like be awful mishaps and pitfalls. But then there's also something where there is a kind of suspension of disbelief that is required to do somatic practice. This is part of the contradiction, because you are actually, it can almost feel performative. It can almost feel like, okay, here I'm doing this move that is like about, like I'm doing this sort of centered, like I'm making a centered request, or I'm I'm walking up to a person as though to apply some pressure. And this is, we do all these weird like practices. And there is some suspension of disbelief in the sense that like, here we are in a room, either one-on-one or in a group, like really like moving towards each other and like asking, what do we notice? Like contact or, eye contact, what do we notice? And depending on what's going on for people, like, and whatever unfolds from there. We're constantly doing that. We're constantly navigating that. And it requires some suspension of disbelief. And it required, at the same time, weird shit happens. Like you feel stuff.
Yeah.
Like, you walk up to me and stand uncomfortably close for uncomfortably long, and we all know it's a practice and we're just in a room doing that thing. It still feels uncomfortable. But it gives us a way in to sort of what's going on for me.
Yeah.
And does reorganizing myself in some way give me some more, what does it make possible? Like if I lengthen my exhales and gravity, gravity is the shortest distance in space time. But actually then, like if we drop into gravity, which is just basically just get super heavy. I mean, just right now, we can all just sort of drop into our sits bones and drop into our feet and lengthen our exhales. And does it make something possible? What does it make possible to add that to the conversation? So even like in a setting where there's practices happening, there's like this, suspension of disbelief, and there's stuff happening.
Yeah.
Right. So all that to say, like, to me, that's a tension.
Yeah.
That one, we have to account for the weirdness of it, and at the same time, the possibility that exists inside of these weird practices. But then there is such a thing as the kind of overly literal, overly essentialized, like pitfall that exists with all of that, that we have to also constantly like keep like unfurling and not make rote. And I've seen that happen in somatics culture, and it dovetails very neatly with self-help culture.
Yeah.
And it dovetails very neatly with sort of self-care tropes. And it can all become a very little insular little system unless we, I think, connect the dots to understanding society and learning how to move inside of society to change it. And that's like organizing skills. That's like, building with other people unlike us. That looks like actually having an understanding of contradictions in society, but then learning how to move through them. And not like in some fixed way, but through a process of practice and reflection collectively that keeps undoing roteness, that keeps undoing determinism, but at the same time is trying to fucking change things. We have no power. We have to build with one another to become a kind of force to reckon with. And prevent the onslaught as much as we can. We have to protect each other. We have to fight for each other's dignity. We have, and each other's longings. I mean, on the left, if we care about the world that we're all trying to bring into being somehow. That is not a world that strips us of our dignities, that strips us of strips people of their resources, that we're trying to usher in something different. To me, there's something then that we have to do with one another that like actually brings us together in a way that we can understand one another across various differences, but also be able to build and move with one another, align with one another optimally in order to change things. We have to understand how those forces work by actually doing the work of practicing something and then reflecting on it, then doing it again, and doing that work, but also trying with some humility and boldness. It's like how do you? It's a lot of mismatched things.
That makes a ton of sense to me, and I think it is so hard to talk about because on the one hand it sounds very abstract, but on the other hand I think it really does activate some things that are very real, both in the world but also as recurrent preoccupations in the traditions of inquiry that I think we value. And just as I think through what you're saying, I think about how there is this robust body, as you know, of psychoanalytic political theory, and I think here by way of Wilhelm Reich or Klaus Teweleit or any of these other figures who really undertake what seems like a somatically oriented reading of how mass mobilization works under fascism, right? Whether it's through like these sort of language of sexuality and these energies that are kind of, like you're sort of chaotic and disavowed homoeroticism. You just throw on some Hugo Boss and take some amphetamines and join like the SS or whatever, right? But also like there is this kind of, but it works. Like it really is a kind of reading of, or even if maybe not literally putting everyone in those institutions on the couch, right? But it does seem to capture this very rigid, repetitive, as you say, rote channeling of energies, and a weaponization of them through these sort of logics of individual into collective processes that are like, wait, no, we're going to goose step now, right? And we're just going to keep goose stepping. And it also involves a type of relationship to tension, which is both used as a constructive principle, but is externalized, which isn't to say that, fascists don't kill one another and they have all these other splits. But like on some level, if you go to a fascist rally and you are among the people who that rally is catering towards, they're going to, on the one hand, it may feel like negative collective effervescence and there's all this reactivity and it's really terrible, but they're also going to be like, this is who you blame. You have problems, you have traumas. Guess it's someone did this to you. Guess what? It's, the Jews, it's the Marxists, whatever it is, right? They're going to give you the person who did you wrong and who you are now going to be oriented against, even as they consolidate you into this, however fragile or death-drive determined unity.
Right, the external scapegoat.
Yeah. Whereas what I take you as describing seems to be, and I think this probably is also at play in some of the things we may have concerns about in some leftish style therapies of the body or thinkings of the body, whether they be kind of, a mindfulness that is kind of apolitical, which is to say, I think it denials, disavows, like, doesn't matter what you're mindful of, just sort of a kind of dippy acceptance or I don't know. I think about some of these things that seem to be gaining traction now in the 2025, like a shamanism that's all about personal growth, but it has nothing to do with the community. I'm like, this is not what that's not my understanding of what shamanism, has traditionally been, to the extent to which that's a discrete term. But beyond that, it's what leaps out at me is that one, there's no like orthopedics of the body that's necessarily being pushed here, right? As best I can tell, like it's not like everyone needs to snap into the posture of the formation of the SS battalion, right? Instead, it's like, what's happening in your body? Let's think about what's happening in your body. What happens in your body next, right? There's a kind of back and forth there that also seems to coexist with a relationship to others who are in the collectivity. Or like it doesn't immediately, the move isn't always to externalize attention or to externalize the contradiction onto some other population. And in that sense, it also seems, and I think this is at play in what you were describing as like a suspension of disbelief, right? Because the suspension of disbelief is a working, almost playful orientation as opposed to like a psychotic fantasy of nostalgia or future vindication or whatever it is, it seems to involve a heightened capacity both for self-reflection and for containing the others or containing your own distress, as you've said. And I think that, to kind of tie a bow on this, and here I'm thinking of something my friend Jess Rosenberg has talked about, right? Where fascism does have this kind of parsimony and stickiness, right? Like, all your distress is blamable on this other. And just wait, there's a solution. We're going to kill them, right? And that's, of course, all lies, but like there's a tightness to this. And if you're not welcome at the rally, you're not welcome at the rally, right? But there's this really tight thing that happens. Whereas in much more of a necessity heterogeneous leftist spaces, where people would, ideally, but also, for worse and for better, encounter very different subjectivities and coalitions and where they're coming from, you of necessity have people voicing their pain and voicing their suffering and experiencing actual friction with one another and articulating that, looking for recognition, reparation, something it's very unclear sometimes. It can become very destructive and produce these sort of internal dynamics, which fascists, even though they killed each other one all the time, police out.
I've been having this image of something that we talked about with Nika Siegel about the idea of the transferential constellation, such that we aren't necessarily just talking about like one clinician and one patient, but rather like an entire hospital full of people who are in, this sort of constant dynamic and often like really uncomfortable and unpleasant at times, suite of relationships to each other. And I'm kind of picturing that at like St. Albans, but I'm also picturing you in a room full of organizers being like, you have to stand uncomfortably close to each other and it's gonna feel bad, but actually like that is a very accurate feeling. And you have to live with like the friction of being so close to difference in order to have this sort of, recognition. And I mean, I guess the other thing I'm thinking about, you've been talking a lot about the language of contradiction. And I guess I'm thinking about it, especially because you are in this, robustly leftist tradition as a kind of form of dialectics, right? Turning inwards in order to turn outward. The condition of the possibility of turning outward in relation is that turning inward in attunement. And that there's also this sort of double-edged sword of attunement to suffering can produce an obsession with one's own suffering. Attunement to suffering can produce compassion. Both of those things are true.
And action towards trying to end it on a material level too. I mean, that's,
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, you add to take what you're saying and, well, first of all, connecting to what Patrick was saying, that, I mean, the right wing, look, armies or like the RSS, the Hindu fascists, I mean, the way their calisthenics practices and yogic, the yogic practices that are used in service of.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right. Hindutva and so
yoga for the BJP.
Yeah. So there's that. And so what is this? What is the sort of counterweight? And yet how do we organize ourselves? I mean, we're organizers. We care about organizing ourselves towards actually thwarting this. I mean, we have like some real intentions in mind, and adding this sort of recognition, like when you're saying, like when you walk up the walk in, walk out example, Abby, that you were bringing up, add to that, like when you knock on doors, right? Like when organizers knock on doors or canvas or go out into the street, because I mean, this is sort of why I connect with organizers because I'm not, and have for like whatever 30 years is that like obsessed with them, frustrated with them, everything like is this, they have to then move into this very like this relationality like with a stranger. They have to move into a relationship with a stranger and really be present in what the purpose of that is, and really like get super curious about this other human being and their interests, and not just push them into like, here's what, here's a pamphlet, here's what I believe, and here's what, and come to this meeting, and hey, I'm going to ask 3 times because that's what my script tells me to do, and here's the wrap. No, they have to be incredibly alive and tender and compassionate and open and curious to this person's interest, and connect, and then go, hey, don't we want to do this together, and will you come to this meeting next Tuesday, 6:00 here? How can we help you be there? And there's so much that's in just that conversation with a stranger.
Yeah.
And they have to do it over and over and over and over again. Or organizing is mundane work. It's beautiful and poetic when people are present in it. And then connecting that micro, that regarding that as a micro conversation that has to happen so many times because we're building numbers too, right? But then also really getting into the weeds of the really difficult differences that exist and the conflicts that exist, just in trying to get clear on how to optimally align for our moment in history in order to actually have some kind of impact, and so that our descendants get something else. Like, we have to have that level of discipline, even that, like, what we do in our finite lives, we won't necessarily see the fruits of at all. And if and we have to organize ourselves that way as well, that there's a short-term thing that might be all in the weeds of policy changes and and non-reformist reforms, whatever, but then there's like this long-term, like, deep commitment and purpose to, and this real wager, that, like, by doing this, we really will build, we will change things for ourselves, and then if not for ourselves, then our descendants.
Yeah.
That it's we're looking to people. We have to care about people. We care about people who we don't know,
Mm-hmm.
and who don't exist yet. And there's something there that I think is this other deeper drive. That is also the sort of beauty of the organizer.
Sumitra, if our listeners want to learn more about somatics, what directions would you send them in?
One thing that I really love saying over and over again is that we're just like this very nascent, very experimental field where, especially when we're trying to connect the dots to a kind of more politicized form of somatics. But, there are some, like Black Organizers for Leadership and Dignity are an organization to explore. There's the Embodiment Institute. There's generative somatics. There's the Strozzi Institute. There's and then there's new left formations and codification processes that are engaging now in a different way in this moment, like North Star Socialist Organization. They're all that are exploring these particular contradictions. How do we be? How do we involve embodied practices in our questions about how to make change happen? But there's the Organizing Center in Philly. There's there's the Institute for the Development of Human Arts. There's a range of places where people are having, I think, like, humble, curious, and like, just they're trying things
Yeah.
in a principled way, but have a humility about how we haven't gotten this figured out. Like, this is not this. There's actually an incredible, beautiful, syncretic set of traditions that find itself in somatics. But the way that we're sort of connecting the dots now and what we know now, and connecting neuroscience to various different practices, some ancient, some very current and like sort of innovative, like that, all of that, that's messy stuff. So
Yeah.
so we're trying things, and we're trying things carefully. And there are some people more humble than others around it.
Where can our listeners find more about you and the Action Lab on the internet?
We have a website, actionlabny.org. And we also have fellowship applications that are, that we're just announced our fall 2025 applications are live now. We're recruiting base building organizers as much as possible, but really this, and we have a small number of slots right now, but we're going to keep growing those. So ideally, we'll have more and more wide open practice circles that people can come to as well. So the Art of Purpose is something to look for on the website.
Amazing.
That's another way to stay in touch.
Thank you so much.
This was phenomenal.
It's been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for making the time to talk with us today.
It's such a pleasure. And it's amazing to be able to talk to one of your favorite podcasts.
Oh, thank you.
So I am it's a total pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. If you'd like to support the show, which is made entirely possible and kept ad-free for everyone by the generosity of our Patreon community, and if you'd like to get 2 additional paywalled episodes per month, come and find us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Sumitra Rajkumar. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.